In 11 days, the Soviet Union destroyed an entire Japanese army of 700,000 men. Kill ratio 30-1. This wasn't a battle. It was the erasure of a nation's 40-year humiliation. August 9th, 1940. Japan had just endured 2 atomic bombs. Now, something impossible was happening in the north. Soviet tanks were appearing everywhere, not pushing through Japanese defensive lines. They were already behind them. In some places, Soviet armor was advancing 150 kilometers in a single day through terrain Japanese planners had deemed impassable. Communications across the entire Manchurian front had simply vanished. Officers who tried to organize responses found their units already surrounded. In Moscow, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky watched his 3 armies execute the largest coordinated offensive in Asian history. 1.6 million troops, 5,500 tanks, 300 aircraft against an enemy that still believed they could hold. This was revenge 40 years in the making, and when it ended, an entire Japanese army would simply cease to exist. What you're about to hear is the story of Operation August Storm, the campaign that may have ended World War II faster than the atomic bombs. The military operation that settled a national humiliation so deep it survived revolution, civil war, and the fall of an empire. Every nation remembers its humiliations. Few get the chance to erase them completely. For Russia, that humiliation came in 1905, and it cut deeper than any military defeat before or since. The Russo-Japanese War began on February 8, 1904, when Japanese destroyers launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur without declaring war. What followed shattered the Russian Empire's image as a European great power. At the Battle of Mukden in February and March 1905, over 600,000 troops clashed in what was then the largest land battle in world history. Russian forces suffered approximately 89,000 casualties. Japanese losses reached 1,000. Both armies were devastated, but the Japanese drove the Russians from the field. Mukden fell. The defeat was total. Then came Tsushima, and with it, a humiliation unlike any in modern naval history. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed 18,000 nautical miles around the world to break the Japanese blockade of Port Arthur. It was an epic voyage through storms, tropical heat, and diplomatic incidents. When they finally reached the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan on May 27, 1905, Admiral Togo's fleet was waiting. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Japanese sank or captured 21 of 38 Russian warships. Over 5,000 Russian sailors died. Japanese losses were minimal. 3 torpedo boats sunk, fewer than 200 casualties. It was the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar. One of Russia's 2 remaining fleets had ceased to exist in a single day. The Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905 formalized Russia's defeat. Japan gained control of Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia recognized the Japanese dominance in Korea and evacuated Manchuria. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had decisively defeated a European empire in a major war. The disaster went beyond military defeat. Inside Russia, the catastrophe triggered the revolution of 1905. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to grant constitutional reforms he never intended to honor. The military humiliation became inseparable from the regime's weakness. But here's what makes this story remarkable. When the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in 1910, they inherited the wound. Communist revolutionaries who rejected everything about Tsarist Russia still remembered Tsushima, still felt the shame of Port Arthur, still burned with the desire to settle accounts. Soviet military doctrine developed in the shadow of 1904. Red Army theorists studied the failures at Mukden and Tsushima like surgeons studying fatal errors. They identified the causes: poor leadership, technological inferiority, inadequate logistics, and above all, outdated tactics against a modern enemy. They would not repeat those mistakes. The Red Army's emphasis on mechanization, combined arms warfare, and what Soviet theorists called deep operations reflected a determination to never again suffer the indecision and incompetence that had doomed the Tsar's forces. When Marshal Vasilevsky began planning Operation August Storm in 1940, the revenge narrative was explicit. Soviet propaganda and military orders openly referenced settling accounts for 19 up with the recapture of Port Arthur was given priority attention despite its limited strategic value. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was the erasure of national shame. But revenge requires an enemy, and by August 1945, that enemy was not what it appeared to be. The name Kwantung Army once inspired terror across Asia. At its peak in the late 1930s, it numbered over 700,000 men and represented Japan's finest military force on the Asian mainland. The Kwantung Army had originated as a garrison force to guard Japanese interests around Port Arthur after the Russo-Japanese War. By the 1930s, it had evolved into Japan's primary instrument of imperial expansion. In 1931, Kwantung officers engineered the Mukden incident, fabricating a pretext for the invasion and occupation of Manchuria. But reputations can outlive reality. By the summer of 1945, the force Tokyo still called its elite Continental Army was a hollow shell. While American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they were bleeding the Kwantung Army dry. General Douglas MacArthur's campaign through the Philippines forced Tokyo to strip Manchuria of its best divisions. Every elite unit sent south to stop the American advance was a division the Soviets wouldn't face. American submarines had strangled Japan's oil supply. American bombers had turned Japanese cities into ash. American naval victories had already won the Pacific War. The Soviets would finish it on land. What remained in Manchuria by August 1940 was a facade. Of 25 divisions, only 6 were considered combat ready. The rest consisted of poorly trained conscripts, reservists, and rear echelon support personnel. The Army's nominal strength was around 700,000, but combat effectiveness was a fraction of that number. The equipment told the story. The Kwantung Army fielded approximately fast tanks and mostly obsolete light tanks that Soviet T-34s could destroy at 1,000 meters without taking return fire. Artillery numbered about 6-7 apiece, but ammunition was scarce. Their Air Force had roughly 800 aircraft grounded by fuel shortages. Those that could fly were obsolete designs facing modern Soviet fighters. The Japanese had seen modern Soviet warfare before. In 1939, at Khalkhin Gol, General Georgy Zhukov's forces had encircled and destroyed Japanese units using combined arms and deep penetration tactics. Japanese casualties exceeded 20,000. The lesson was clear. Japanese doctrine could not compete with Soviet operational art. Senior Kwantung officers knew they faced a superior enemy. But the Army lacked the tanks, trucks, fuel, and training to adapt. They were forced to prepare for a war they knew they could not win. Japanese commanders had one hope: the greater Khingan Mountains, an impassable natural barrier, or so they thought. Against this phantom army, the Soviets assembled overwhelming force. The Transbaikal Front, under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, deployed approximately 64,000 troops with 2,359 tanks. The First Far Eastern Front, under Marshal Kirill Meretskov, fielded about 586,000 troops with Vati tanks. The Second Far Eastern Front, under General Maxim Prokhayev, added another 337,000 troops with 600 tanks. In total, approximately 1.6 million troops, 500 tanks, over 1,000 artillery pieces, and 3,700 aircraft. Soviet tank forces outnumbered Japanese armor by at least 4-1. The quality gap was even larger. Soviet T-34-85 medium tanks, IS-2 heavy tanks, and Su-66 self-propelled guns were combat-proven designs that had broken the Wehrmacht. Soviet air power was absolute. 3,700 modern Yak-9, La-5, and Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft faced obsolete Japanese planes that couldn't fly. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. The Soviets had developed a doctrine that transformed numerical superiority into operational annihilation. Deep operations, or Glubokaya Operatsiya, was devastatingly effective. In plain English, hit everywhere at once, race deep behind enemy lines, and surround entire armies before they can react. Instead of attacking on a single axis and grinding through defenses, Soviet forces would attack simultaneously across multiple axes. They would penetrate deep into enemy rear areas. Fast-moving formations of tanks and mechanized infantry would exploit breakthroughs and drive hundreds of kilometers beyond the front line. They would bypass strong points rather than reducing them, leaving isolated defenders to be mopped up later. The goal was not to push the enemy back, but to encircle and destroy entire formations. Shatter command and control, prevent any organized response. The Germans had taught the Soviets how to fight modern war through 4 years of blood. Now, the Japanese would face the graduates. In 72 hours, this force would do something the Japanese considered impossible. At exactly midnight on August 9th, 1945, Soviet forces attacked simultaneously across all 3 fronts. The Japanese had intelligence indicating a Soviet buildup. They couldn't imagine the speed and violence of what followed. Within hours, Japanese defenses were crumbling. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi of the Kwantung Army later captured the chaos. It was as if a thunderbolt had struck. We had no time to organize, no reserves to plug the breaches. Soviet tanks appeared everywhere, and our communications collapsed. Japanese static defensive positions designed to stop World War I-style frontal assaults were simply bypassed. Soviet operational maneuver groups identified weak points, punched through, and raced into the rear. Japanese strong points found themselves isolated, surrounded, and irrelevant. The Transbaikal Front executed the deepest and most audacious thrust. Malinovsky's forces faced what the Japanese considered an impassable natural barrier, the Greater Khingan Mountain Range. The mountains were rugged, arid, and cut by few roads. Japanese planners assumed no modern mechanized force could cross them quickly. They were catastrophically wrong. Soviet engineers and tank crews had prepared meticulously. When the offensive began, Soviet tank columns plunged into the mountains and emerged on the other side with stunning speed. Senior Sergeant Ivan Pavlovich Kovalev, a T-34 driver with the 6th Guards Tank Army, later recalled, "We drove for 3 days without stopping. The heat was like driving through hell, 120 degrees inside the tank. Our gunner passed out twice, but we kept moving. The Japanese had not even mined the passes. When we came down out of those mountains and saw the Manchurian plains spread out before us, we knew they were finished." In some sectors, Soviet units covered up to 150 kilometers in a single day. The advance through terrain, the Japanese thought, would take weeks, happened in days. The three-front coordination created impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders: defend everywhere and be strong nowhere, or concentrate forces against one thrust and be encircled by the others. But Soviet victory came at a cost. Over 12,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or wounded in the first days. Tank crews fought in 120-degree desert heat, their steel coffins baked under the Manchurian sun. Engineers cleared minefields under fire. Supply columns raced to keep fuel and ammunition flowing across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Soviet logistics, honed through years of continental warfare, kept the spearheads moving. But it was brutal, exhausting work. Soviet tank commanders who had fought through Poland, Ukraine, and Germany reported with astonishment how differently this campaign felt. Major General Vasily Ryazanov of the 5th Guards Tank Army noted, "The Japanese positions melted away before our tanks, unlike the dogged resistance of the Germans." One veteran described it as a walk compared to the hell of Berlin and Stalingrad. The contrast was stark. German defenders had fought for every meter. They counterattacked with panzers and panzerfausts. They turned cities into fortresses. Japanese defenders, lacking mobile reserves and modern anti-tank weapons, could only watch as Soviet armor bypassed their bunkers and drove into the rear. The speed of advance maintained operational coherence despite the distances. Tank columns that covered 150 kilometers in a day still had fuel and ammunition when they reached their objectives. By the time Japanese commanders realized the Soviets were across the mountains, Soviet spearheads were already seizing key cities and rail junctions deep in Manchuria. Key milestones marked the campaign's relentless progress. By August 11th through 14th, Soviet spearheads had crossed the Greater Khingan Mountains and seized key rail junctions. Japanese units that tried to establish new defensive lines found Soviet tanks arriving before they could dig in. Attempts to withdraw turned into routs. Then came August 9th. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers who had been fighting hours before laid down their weapons. Officers committed suicide rather than face the dishonor of surrender. By August 18th through 20th, Soviet forces had seized Mukden, Changchun, Harbin, and Port Arthur. The Kwantung Army, once the terror of Asia, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Japanese soldiers described the terror of facing an enemy that appeared everywhere at once, Soviet armor would emerge from unexpected directions. Guns blazing, air attacks were constant. There was no safe rear area. Communications were dead. Officers had no information and no orders. Men surrendered in groups of hundreds, then thousands. The tempo of operations was beyond anything Japanese officers had experienced. The fog of war had become total. 3 days before Operation August Storm began, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The weapon killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly. On August 9th, the exact same day the Soviets attacked, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. For Japanese leadership, the combination created a crisis that shattered any remaining hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. Imperial Conference minutes from August 9th and 10th revealed the panic the Soviet invasion created among top officials. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Army Chief Yoshijiro Umezu cited the Soviet entry as shattering any hope for mediation or continued resistance. Japan's strategy for ending the war had relied on the Soviet Union. Despite being ideological enemies, Stalin had maintained a neutrality pact with Japan. Japanese diplomats had been pursuing Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace. The Soviet invasion destroyed that strategy in a single night. There would be no mediation. There would be no negotiated peace. Japan now faced a two-front war it could not possibly win. American forces under MacArthur were preparing to invade the home islands from the south. Soviet forces were destroying Japanese armies in Manchuria and would soon threaten Korea and the home islands from the north. The strategic situation was hopeless. So, which weapon truly ended the war? The atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion? Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and others argue the Soviet invasion was the decisive factor in forcing Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs were devastating, but Japan had already endured months of conventional firebombing that killed more people than both atomic bombs combined. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities were burning. The civilian population was starving, yet the military leadership had continued to resist. They were preparing for a final defense of the home islands that would cost millions of lives. The Soviet invasion changed the calculation. It exposed Japanese armies to immediate and total destruction. The speed of the Soviet advance meant that every hour of delay resulted in tens of thousands more troops lost and hundreds of kilometers more territory seized. The pressure was unbearable. If Japan did not surrender immediately, there would be nothing left to surrender. For Americans, the atomic bombs symbolized the war's end. But in Tokyo's Imperial Palace, generals were equally terrified of Soviet armies racing through Manchuria. The two superpowers, America and the USSR, delivered a 1-2 punch that made surrender inevitable. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. He cited the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, but also the changing military situation. The Soviet invasion was implicit in that statement. The debate continues among historians, but what's clear is that the combination of atomic weapons and Soviet invasion within 48 hours created a dual crisis that overwhelmed Japanese decision-making and forced surrender. While the world debated which weapon ended the war, Soviet forces were already writing their own answer in the ruins of Port Arthur. Soviet forces deliberately raised the red banner over Port Arthur Fortress on August 22, 1947. Marshal Vasilevsky ensured the symbolic location received priority attention despite its limited military value. The fortress, whose fall in 1905 had symbolized Russian humiliation, now witnessed Russian triumph. The moment was captured in photographs and newsreels. Soviet propaganda made it the emotional centerpiece of victory celebrations. Official Soviet communiques and propaganda explicitly referenced settling accounts for 1905 and avenging Tsushima. The revenge narrative was not subtext, it was the text. Soviet newspapers ran headlines celebrating the reversal of 1905. Radio broadcasts reminded listeners of Tsushima and Mukden. Military orders of the day invoked the memory of Russian sailors who had died 40 years earlier. The campaign was framed as the redemption of national honor. The final casualty figures revealed the campaign's devastating nature. Soviet losses totaled approximately 12,000 casualties, including 2,300 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 80,000 killed, roughly 15,000 wounded, and between 594,000 and 60,000 taken prisoner. The kill ratio approached 30 to 1. Territorial gains were measured not in kilometers, but in hundreds of kilometers. In some sectors, Soviet spearheads covered up to 800 kilometers over the 11-day campaign. They averaged between 40 and 70 kilometers per day. This pace exceeded even the most successful Soviet operations against Germany. Soviet forces recaptured every piece of territory lost in 1905. Southern Sakhalin, ceded to Japan in the Treaty of Portsmouth, was retaken. The Kuril Islands, promised to Stalin at Yalta, were occupied. Soviet influence in Manchuria, lost in 1905, was restored. The geopolitical order of Northeast Asia was rewritten in 11 days. The symbolism extended beyond military victory. In 1900, Russia had been defeated by an Asian nation and exposed as a declining power. In 1940, the Soviet Union annihilated that same nation's army in less than 2 weeks. The reversal was total, but the campaign's end marked not liberation, but the beginning of a different nightmare for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Between 594,000 and 60,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner by Soviet forces. This mass captivity represented one of the largest forced labor operations in modern history. The prisoners were deported to labor camps across Siberia and the Soviet Far East. There, they worked in mines, forests, and construction projects under brutal conditions. Captain Takeo Yamamoto of the 3rd Infantry Division was among them. He survived 3 winters in a timber camp north of Lake Baikal. Years later, he described the experience. "We cut trees in temperatures that froze your breath in midair. Men died from exhaustion, cold, and starvation. We had expected to return home after Japan's surrender. Instead, we found ourselves in a frozen hell with no end in sight." Various estimates suggest between 60,000 and potentially much higher numbers of prisoners died in captivity. Those who survived endured years of hard labor in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Many prisoners were not repatriated until 19 years after the war's end. Stalin used the prisoners as a labor resource and as a bargaining chip in post-war negotiations with Japan. Families in Japan had no information about whether their loved ones were alive or dead. For Japan, the prisoner issue poisoned relations with the Soviet Union for decades. Even today, the fate of Japanese prisoners in Siberia remains a sensitive topic in Japanese historical memory. Operation August Storm proved a broader point about modern warfare. The gap between doctrines matters more than the gap between courage. Japanese soldiers fought when they could, but they were trapped in World War I defensive concepts. They faced an enemy that had mastered World War II operational art. Static defenses were bypassed. Linear thinking was shattered by simultaneous multi-axis attacks. Courage could not overcome obsolete equipment, inadequate training, and a doctrine designed for a war that no longer existed. The Soviet deep battle tactics employed in Manchuria represented the culmination of 4 years of brutal learning on the Eastern Front. Operational maneuver groups penetrated hundreds of kilometers. They bypassed strong points and encircled entire formations. The tempo of operations prevented any organized response. The coordination of 3 fronts attacking simultaneously created impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders. The result was a form of warfare that rendered traditional defensive concepts obsolete. Operation August Storm answered multiple historical questions simultaneously. It was the Soviet Union's calculated revenge for 1905's humiliation, a wound so deep it transcended revolution and survived 40 years of political upheaval. It was a devastating demonstration that modern deep battle doctrine could annihilate an army still fighting the previous war. And it may have been as decisive as the atomic weapons enforcing Japan's surrender. It destroyed the last hope for mediated peace. It exposed Japanese armies to immediate annihilation. It established the Soviet Union as a Pacific superpower, rewriting the geopolitical order of Northeast Asia in less than 2 weeks. For American veterans of the Pacific War, Operation August Storm was the campaign they never fought. While Americans prepared to invade Japan at a cost of potentially 1 million casualties, Stalin's armies destroyed Japan's last major field force in less than 2 weeks. The atomic bombs dropped by American bees in the Soviet invasion, launched from Siberian staging grounds, together ended the war. They ended it before American soldiers had to storm the beaches of Honshu. They ended it before MacArthur's planned Operation Downfall could begin. The Red Banner over Port Arthur in 1945 did not just mark a military victory. It erased Tsushima from Russian memory. It announced the arrival of a new superpower in Asia, born from the ashes of 1905's defeat. The Kwantung Army, once the terror of Asia, was erased in 11 days. And the world learned that some historical debts are paid not in diplomacy, but in the complete destruction of armies. 11 days, 1.6 million troops, a kill ratio of 30-1, and the final settling of accounts for the greatest humiliation in Russian history. That was Operation August Storm. If you enjoyed this story of one of World War II's most decisive yet overlooked campaigns, hit subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries every week. Thanks for watching.